The third and final question on the AP Lang free response section is the argument essay, also called the Q3. On the AP Lang Q3, you're given a topic to consider and just asked to argue a position on it. That's it. It's like a Q1, but with no sources. So you may be asking yourself, without sources, where does my evidence come from? Well, this requires making a little shift in your understanding of what evidence is. And it's really the premise behind how we've studied argumentation all year. Because remember, evidence is just any idea that supports a claim, right? That's all evidence is. And we've also talked about how evidence comes in two forms. Premises, which are logical statements that, if true, make the claim true, and examples, which are specific instances that are used to support some broader generalization. Before this year, your understanding of evidence has been very limited, but in reality, evidence is a much broader concept. And because of the way a lot of students have been taught about what evidence is, they actually struggle with the Q3. In fact, the scores on the Q3 are always, year in and year out, the lowest of the three essay scores. And I personally think, having scored the Q3 one of the years that I've been an AP grader, I think it's because students focus way too much on finding what they think is evidence. Yeah, most students, and this is not your fault, it's just the way that we teach you in a poor way here. Most students think that evidence has to come from something. And so these students will stress out trying to match up the prompt they're given with historical events or novels that they've read or current events. In fact, I know a lot of teachers who teach those three things specifically. This is how they teach the Q3. It's terrible. They teach students to support their thesis with one historical event, one thing from the reading, and one current event. That's garbage. That's totally artificial and not the way you actually argue something. What students are really struggling with here, and by extension some of their teachers, is that they're confusing the concept of examples with evidence. So what they're doing is they're substituting actual evidence, which is a broader concept, with a much more specific concept of specific examples. And oftentimes, when they focus on evidence in this way, their arguments don't contain any actual logical premises, which means they just have a whole bunch of loosely connected examples with no reasoning behind them. And of course, this creates a ton of stress. And it does because they don't really know what they're doing, and that's because they've been taught this really artificial process. But you guys won't have that problem, right? Because the whole year we focused on learning argumentation in one specific way. We know that a claim should first, a primary claim, like in an extended argument, your primary claim needs to be first supported by logical premises, the actual reasons why. Then those premises can be supported by, well, other premises or by examples. They can be illustrated by examples. And that's what you really have to think of examples as something that can illustrate a concept. When you focus your Q3 argument essay on coming up not with specific examples, but coming up with first logical premises that support that primary claim, you're going to write a more effective essay and you're going to be a lot less stressed out. With that in mind, let's take a look at our first Q3 argument essay of the year. This is a prompt that was released, probably back in 2008 or 9, and it's over the concept of incentivizing charity. Let's read the prompt together. A weekly feature of the New York Times Magazine is a column by Randy Cohen called The Ethicist, in which people raise ethical questions to which Cohen provides answers. The question below is from the column that appeared on April 4th, 2003. And it goes like this. At my high school, various clubs and organizations sponsor charity drives, asking students to bring in money, food, and clothing. Some teachers offer bonus points on tests and final averages as incentives to participate. Some parents believe that this sends a morally wrong message, undermining the value of charity as a selfless act. Is the exchange of donations for grades okay? The practice of offering incentives for charitable acts is widespread, from school projects to fund drives by organizations such as public television stations to federal income tax deductions for contributions to charities. Write an essay that argues your position on the ethics of offering incentives for charitable acts. In your response, you should do the following. Respond to the prompt with a thesis that presents a defensible position. Provide evidence to support your line of reasoning or lines of reasoning. Explain how the evidence supports your lines of reasoning. And finally, use appropriate grammar and punctuation in communicating your argument. All right, so this is a little bit of an older prompt, but you might get a prompt like this on the AP exam. And this is an example of a prompt that has a little bit of stimulus to go with the actual prompt. This little example of an article, or excuse me, an article from Randy Cohen's The Ethicist, where someone asks him about the ethics of exchanging donations for grades. However, that's just part of the stimulus. This prompt is asking you to write about the ethics of offering incentives for charitable acts. So this is not an essay about exchanging grades for donations. Okay, that's just part of the stimulus. Yeah. When you see an essay prompt like this, you need to be able to distinguish between what the prompt is actually asking you to write about and just the stimulus material that's there to get your ideas flowing. So it's asking you to write about the ethics of offering incentives for charitable acts. Could you use the exchange of grades for donations as a line of reasoning? Of course you could. But you would never want to write your whole essay about the exchange of grades for donations. I love how in this particular example, the parents believes that it sends a morally wrong message about donating. What about the message it sends about the value of grades, how they can just be transactions with no learning behind them? I think that's kind of funny. So once again, I'm going to ask you guys to please support your position on this essay with 3 different lines of reasoning. And this can be 3 separate premises, all 3 supporting the primary claim, or it can just be 1 or 2 separate premises supporting the primary claim, but with multiple premises supporting those premises. So any way you come up with your 3 lines of reasoning and how they all connect to your claim, well, you have some freedom there. For instance, this model, 3 discrete premises all supporting that primary claim, that would work fine. Or you could do something like this with 2 discrete premises supporting the primary claim, but one of those premises broken up into 2 separate lines of reasoning. You could also presumably do something like this. Your primary claim about the ethics of incentivized charity supported by a single premise, but that single premise is backed up by 3 separate lines of reasoning. Okay, that's also an option here. In addition to requiring that you use 3 separate lines of reasoning, this time I want one of your lines of reasoning to be a refutation of a counter argument. So in your essay, whenever you refute a counter argument, you have to first paraphrase what the counter argument is. So you have to paraphrase the claim and evidence. You'll probably want to use a device like hypophora, procatalepsis, not hypophora, the prebuttal that we talked about, how some might argue this, and you have to summarize the claim and the evidence that would be given, and then rebut it by pointing out the flaws in that particular argument, and then fully refute it by arguing why it's incorrect. Here's an example of how that might look on your argument map. I am going to ask you guys to make another argument map for this. If you went with like a 2 discrete premises supporting your primary claim, your refutation line of reasoning would be right there with your other lines of reasoning. The only difference here is that in a supporting line of reasoning, you're usually arguing that something is the case, that something is true, that something is ethical or is not ethical. The refutation line of reasoning is going to argue that something is not this particular way, and that's because you're addressing the counter argument. So when you create your argument map, and this is in the instructions, you would never put the actual counter argument itself in the argument map, but you would put your refutation of it as one of your lines of reasoning. So remember, our topic here is the ethics of offering incentives for charitable acts. We need to process this topic to help us brainstorm for appropriate positions, just like we did with the synthesis essay prompt. You need to ask yourself these 3 questions. Should our primary claim, like our response to this topic, should it be about the past, present, or potential future? Are there clear sides to this topic? And if so, what are they? And then finally, what limitations are there on the different angles of examination that we can use? Yeah, so starting with number one there, should our primary claim be about the past, present, or potential future? Present, definitely in the present tense. There's nothing in the prompt language about what should or should not be done. It's just about what is. Is this ethical or not ethical? Are there clear sides to this topic? Well, yeah, it's a question of ethics, right? So the defense position would be saying that offering incentives for charity is ethical. The challenge position, offering incentives for charitable acts, is not ethical. There's many different ways that you could qualify this as well. Number three, what limitations are there? Well, we have to examine it from that angle of ethics, right? So all reasoning that we come up with must pertain to ultimately what is ethically right or ethically wrong. A good way to begin brainstorming on a prompt like this that has two clear opposing sides is to think of the reasons that support each side. So you can do this with just a simple T-chart. One side would be reasons why it is ethical. The other side, reasons why it is not ethical. And once you come up with those reasons, then you can just kind of look back at your T-chart and think about which side of it would be easiest to defend. The T-chart will also help you come up with any concessions or qualifications you'd like to make to temper your position. So if you take the defense position, we'll look over at the challenge position for any particular concessions or qualifications you need to make. Also, you can use these ideas to figure out what idea you want to raise as your counter argument that you ultimately refute.